Welcome to this video where you will learn how to configure Blaze Inventory material types. You configure a material type to define the characteristics of a particular kind of material used in Blaze Inventory. This video covers the most commonly used features of material types. There are advanced topics to cover advanced features in another video. Now, materials in a lab can have variations which affect how granular the material type definitions should be. Give careful consideration to avoid unnecessary proliferation of nearly identical material types while still capturing what is unique to a given material type in terms of its end use. Identification of material types is at two levels, via a unique and recognizable code and name. The code should be selected to be an abbreviated but familiar identification for a material, whereas the name is usually a longer and more formal identifier. Material types capture physical properties, hazard information including an MSDS, an ELN-style recipe for creating the material types, and property value identifications for use of the material type or for releasing it as acceptable for use. Refer to the Blaze Inventory Guide or the support hotline for further information as needed. For best video quality, set your display in the control panel to at least 1024 by 768. Set your browser page zoom to 100%, and in some cases, full screen produces better results. It's very important to consider naming conventions when defining material types for the most successful application of Blaze Inventory. Material types define a kind of material, usually irrespective of container, vendor, or quantities, unless those things affect end use. Material type names will be visible throughout Blaze Inventory and should be chosen with care to be recognizable and meaningful to users. Now, material type should be defined with a granularity that provides for the end use of the material. For example, if you store 10% ethanol and 20% ethanol, you should create a material type for each, rather than an ethanol material type, because the end use for the two concentrations is different. They are not interchangeable as to their end use. Use industry standard names where available. Use a more abbreviated value for the code and a longer, more comprehensive value for the name. The code is the value that will appear on most screens and be used in data entry. Consider names that allow for future expansion in the materials your lab uses. In the above example, you might have only one solution of ethanol and begin by naming it ethanol. Later on, if you add a different concentration, you'll have to go change the previous names. Try to be as explicit as possible to make clear identification of the kind of material you're defining. And the maximum length of the material code is 40 characters, and although the full 40 will not be visible on many screens, it's possible to avoid ambiguity when the full name will not be immediately visible. Usually it's best to make the names user-friendly rather than conform to names used by instruments, legacy systems, contract labs, customer reports, and so on that are less friendly. In considering whether to confine your entries to uppercase or mixed case, it's usually best for material type names to use mixed case. Avoid analysis paralysis, as arriving at proper naming and granularity is often an iterative process. Names can be changed later in the configuration process. You create a new material type in Blaze Inventory by selecting the Configure Track Material Type Information menu option. To create a material type, you're required to enter both a material code, which is usually an abbreviated form unique identifier for the material type, and a name, which might be a longer identifier. For example, in this case, the material codes were often selected to be identical to the material name, but in other cases there's a code specific to a particular application, and then a more full-fledged and meaningful material name. And you can also enter a description. Now, there are many fields associated with a material type which are for information only and are not used for specific purposes in Blaze Inventory except on reports or to assist in identification of other information that's useful in applying the material type. Things like the application, special instructions, classification. It's important to know that for all of these drop-downs, you can customize the content of the drop-downs to change the legal set of values for any particular entry. If your inventory system is segregated into multiple areas which operate relatively independently, you might want to consider assigning an area to a particular inventory item. That allows for segregation of the data so that only that area perhaps can create the item, view it, and use it, or perhaps only create it where other areas would be able to view it and use it. When we cover the configuration of item types, we will describe the use of area more comprehensively. You can also capture the physical properties associated with a material type. Most of these fields are for informational purposes only, for inclusion on reports or labels. However, the specific gravity can be used internally within Blaze Inventory to convert between volumetric and mass-based quantities, either for use in calculations or for tracking the material quantities in the inventory system. In addition, any of these variables are available for use in equations. You can also capture hazards information, which is often useful for inclusion on travelers, on labels, and on reports. It is possible at this time to conveniently capture an MSDS document associated with a particular material type. The document in this case is transferred to the server and cataloged, and then it can be viewed at any time when one is viewing this material type. When we discuss documents later in this video, we will cover the various other kinds of documents that can be captured and stored associated with a material type. For material types that are formulated in the laboratory, you can define, to as much detail as you wish, a process for preparing those materials. It has the form of your typical ELN worksheet, where you can define steps associated with the process and reference kinds of equipment and kinds of materials used in the process. While all the details associated with the definition of preparation are described in more detail in a later video, this example illustrates the definition of two different steps, the first of which is to identify the equipment that you're going to be using in the process, which would later on then be identified specifically as to which balance and which flask is used when the material is constructed. In addition, a second step creates a solution based on two ingredients of material types that are in inventory, quantities that are to be added, goal quantities to be weighed, and then possibly calculations of end results associated with the actual material that's weighed in producing the material type. Now, in addition, then, you can capture an SOP preparation document associated with this whole process, which can be viewed when you're creating the material type, and you can print a summary report. These will be covered later in this video. For a particular material type, you can also create a set of properties that you wish to track and capture that are associated with a specific instance of a material type. Properties are predefined as test types in the system. That's covered in a separate video. But you can pull in those properties, assign a goal value to them, define the units, and min and max values and a default value that would be used to check for validity of information that's entered possibly off of a COA, that's entered from a measurement in the laboratory, or that's calculated from other operations in the prep step. Properties that are produced, property values that are produced in the prep step by calculations are automatically stored in the property set if the name is the same. You can also provide a printed spec and a traceability statement as to where the properties originate. The use of properties is a great assistance where materials are quarantined and later released based on criterion associated with usability. But the definition of properties at the material type does provide a template that's automatically filled out when a particular material of this type is created. You can capture a variety of documents and attach them to a material type. As a starting point, there's a list of kinds of documents, including the material document, definition document, and MSDS, hazards, protection, and so on. These are by definition associated with particular buttons in the system where you can capture an MSDS of hazards, protective equipment, and so on. However, any of these documents can also be captured on the general document screen. The details associated with these documents, which are called managed documents, are covered in a separate video. However, we can illustrate that a MSDS document can be captured. It is stored on the server and referenced in this table. The table can show all active documents or all documents. In this case, the MSDS is new and is not available yet for use, so we can approve it. A process that is configured to require a password, and we can activate it. A process that's configured not to require a password. So we can see when it was created, when it was approved, and when it is activated. Now it's available for use anywhere in the system as a view option. At any time, it can be fetched and edited, recaptured, or viewed. At any point, there is available a summary report, which is a crystal report which you can customize to your particular needs, which captures and outputs all the properties associated with a particular material type, including hazards, physical properties, preparation procedures, and documents tied to the material type, and so forth. As we saw in our data model, there's a relationship between material types and item types, which another video describes their definition. However, for convenience, there is a References tab which allows us to go and edit or look at the associated item types for this material type. In addition, the material type entry screen has a comments section where one or more comments can be entered, and an audit section which describes every field that's been modified through the various versions of the material type, including the username, the date, time, the version number, and the old and new values associated with that modification. This completes our description of defining material types. Thank you for taking the time to learn more about Blaze Inventory. Now, as an exercise, configure 10 or so material types, choosing from a variety that will ultimately be used in your system, and that include purchased and internally created items with and without property specifications. Associated item types will have various workflows, including release, activate, use, dispose, etc. The associated item types will be kits and the contents of kits if you do use kits in your system. And the associated material types would have captured and/or reference files such as MSDSs. If you have any questions in the course of this exercise, call the Blaze LIMS hotline or communicate via email. Once you are finished, call the Blaze LIMS hotline for review of the mechanisms, naming, and so forth that you used in configuring these material types.